I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath until the refrigerator door swung open and the light hit his face. It was 1 in the morning, maybe later. The kind of hour where time stops mattering because you've crossed some invisible line between one day and the next, and you're suspended in a pocket of the world that belongs only to the people awake enough to claim it. The apartment was dark except for that cold white glow spilling across the kitchen tiles, and Jonah stood there in an old t-shirt and sweatpants, barefoot, pulling out containers like he was conducting an inventory. I should have gone back to bed. I'd only gotten up for water. But something about the way he moved, unhurried, comfortable like he owned the silence, made me pause in the doorway. He glanced over his shoulder and grinned, the kind of grin that always made him look younger than 23, less careful. He said, "Hey, you hungry?" And I told him I wasn't, but he was already pulling out the leftover pasta from 2 nights ago, the Thai takeout we'd barely touched, a container of something I didn't even remember ordering. I found myself walking toward the counter anyway. We've been living like this for 4 months. For months of splitting rent and groceries, of arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash, of falling asleep to the sound of each other moving through the apartment in the dark. 4 months of something that felt easy in a way that scared me, because easy things in my life had a habit of becoming complicated the moment I started to depend on them. Jonah was chaos in human form. He left cabinet doors open, bought groceries we didn't need, played music too loud when he cooked. But he also remembered how I took my coffee, and he texted me when he'd be home late, and sometimes when I couldn't sleep he'd wander into the living room and sit with me without asking why. We were friends. That's what I told myself. That's what it was. He popped open the pasta container and stabbed a fork into it, eating directly from the Tupperware like a college student who'd never learned better. I leaned against the counter beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his skin, and he laughed at something. I don't even remember what. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the absurdity of standing in a dark kitchen eating cold pasta at 1 in the morning. Then he speared another bite, twirled it carefully, and turned toward me. He said, "You got to try this," his voice soft, almost conspiratorial, like we were sharing a secret. I hesitated. There was something about the way he held the fork out, the way his eyes stayed on mine, that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. But I leaned in. I let him feed me. The pasta was cold, slightly congealed, probably not even that good. I barely tasted it. What I tasted was the weight of his gaze, the stillness of his hand, hovering there between us even after I'd pulled back. The fork was still extended, like he'd forgotten he was holding it, and I watched his eyes drop, just for a second, to my mouth. Neither of us moved. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside. My own heartbeat, louder than it had any right to be. He blinked, cleared his throat, pulled the fork back. He said something about how the sauce was better reheated, how we should probably just throw it out, how he didn't know why he kept eating it. His voice was normal, easy, the same voice he always used. But I knew. I knew because my chest was tight and my hands were trembling and the air between us had shifted into something I didn't have a name for. I told him I should get some sleep. He nodded, said, "Yeah, me too," and I left him standing there in the glow of the fridge light, still holding that container of pasta like it mattered. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, trying to tell myself that the way he'd looked at me didn't mean anything, that I was reading into a gesture that was probably just casual, friendly, meaningless. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had stayed there, the way he'd watched me, the way the silence between us had felt like something alive, something that had been growing quietly in the spaces we didn't talk about. I'd spent so long being careful, so long keeping my feelings pressed down beneath layers of routine and distraction, telling myself that wanting something didn't mean I deserved to reach for it. I'd learned early that longing was dangerous, that letting someone see you clearly was an invitation for them to leave. And Jonah was the kind of person who could leave, who could wake up one day and decide this wasn't what he wanted, that I wasn't what he wanted, and I'd be left in an apartment that smelled like him, surrounded by the ghost of something I'd never even had the courage to name. So I stayed quiet. I stayed safe. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already changed. That whatever careful distance I'd been maintaining had collapsed the moment I leaned in and let him feed me, the moment I let the silence linger too long without breaking it. The next morning, he was already in the kitchen when I came out. He looked up from his coffee, smiled, said, "Good morning," like nothing had happened. And maybe nothing had. Maybe I was the only one who'd felt the earth shift beneath my feet. But when I poured my own coffee and turned around, I caught him watching me. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to know I hadn't imagined it. I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it, trying not to notice the way he moved through the apartment, the way his presence filled the space even when he wasn't in the room. Try not to count the hours until we'd both be home again, standing in the same kitchen, breathing the same air. Because the truth was, I wanted it to happen again. I wanted him to offer me another bite, to hold the fork out and let the moment stretch between us until one of us was brave enough to do something about it. I wanted to know if the tremor in his hand had been real, or if I'd invented it to make myself feel less alone in this ache. And that terrified me, because wanting something meant risking it. Meant stepping into the light and letting him see me fully, without pretense, without the safety of pretending this was just friendship. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But as the day faded and the apartment grew dark again, as I heard him moving in the kitchen and smelled something cooking, I realized it didn't matter if I was ready. The moment had already begun, and there was no going back. I grew up in a house where silence meant safety, where keeping your head down and your feelings buried was the only way to survive dinner without conflict, the only way to move through the world without drawing the wrong kind of attention. My parents weren't cruel, exactly. They were just absent in the ways that mattered, present only for the surface-level rituals that made us look like a functional family from the outside. I learned early that wanting things out loud was dangerous. That expressing need was the same as handing someone a weapon they could use against you later. So I became careful, measured, the kind of person who observed more than participated, who felt everything deeply but showed nothing at all. By the time I was 22, I'd built an entire life around that carefulness. I chose a quiet job doing data entry for a small firm downtown. I rented this apartment because it was affordable and unremarkable, the kind of place you could disappear into. I kept my routine small and predictable: coffee at 7, work by 8:30, home by 6, dinner alone while watching something I'd seen before. It was a life designed to require nothing from anyone, to protect me from disappointment. Then Jonah answered my ad for a roommate, and everything I'd carefully constructed started to crack. He showed up to look at the place on a Tuesday afternoon, 20 minutes late, carrying a gym bag and wearing a smile that seemed to take up more space than his body. He walked through the apartment like he was already imagining himself living there, opening cabinets, testing the water pressure, asking questions about the neighborhood with genuine curiosity. He said he liked how quiet it was, how the light came in through the living room windows in the afternoon, how the kitchen was big enough for 2 people to actually cook together if they wanted to. I hadn't considered that possibility. Cooking together, sharing the space as anything more than a logistical arrangement. But Jonah made it sound easy, natural. He moved in 2 weeks later with 3 suitcases, a collection of mismatched kitchen supplies, and a Bluetooth speaker he immediately connected to fill the apartment with music I'd never heard before. Within a week, the space felt completely different. Warmer, lived in. He left his shoes by the door and his jackets on the back of chairs, scattered his energy across every room until the silence I'd cultivated felt less like peace and more like loneliness. He cooked constantly, elaborate meals that required too many ingredients and left the kitchen a disaster. Simple things he threw together at midnight when he couldn't sleep, experiments that didn't always work but that he laughed about anyway. And he always made enough for 2. At first, I ate in my room. I told myself I needed the boundaries, the space. But Jonah would knock softly and say, "Hey, I made extra if you want some." And something about the way he offered, casual, undemanding, like my presence was wanted but not required, made it impossible to keep saying no. So I started eating with him. Started sitting at the small table wedged into the corner of the kitchen while he told me about his day, about the customers at the coffee shop where he worked, about his younger sister who called him too often and his mother who didn't call enough. He asked me questions too, but he never pushed when I gave short answers. He just listened, nodded, moved on to something else. He had this way of filling space without making it feel crowded, of being loud and chaotic and messy while somehow making me feel calmer than I had in years. I didn't know what to do with that. With him, Jonah wasn't careful the way I was. He lived like someone who'd never learned to protect himself, who approached the world with an openness that seemed reckless to me. He laughed too easily, trusted too quickly, said exactly what he was thinking without weighing the consequences first. He talked about his ex-boyfriend sometimes, a guy named Marcus who'd left him 6 months before he moved in. He spoke about it without bitterness, just a kind of resigned sadness, like he'd accepted that some people weren't meant to stay. He said Marcus told him he was too much, too emotional, too intense, too present. That loving Jonah felt like drowning. When he told me that, something in my chest tightened, because I understood what Marcus meant, even if I hated him for saying it. Jonah was overwhelming. He demanded nothing and somehow made you want to give him everything anyway. He filled rooms and hearts and silences without even trying, and I was terrified of how much I wanted to let him, because I knew what I was. I was 22 and cautious, and so used to keeping people at a distance that I didn't know how to let anyone closer without panicking. I was someone who'd spent years convincing himself that solitude was the same as safety, that wanting less meant hurting less. But Jonah made me want more, want things I didn't have names for, want to be seen in ways I'd spent my whole life avoiding. The apartment became a study in contrasts, his mess and my order, his noise and my quiet, his openness and my walls. But somehow it worked. Somehow we fell into a rhythm that felt less like compromise and more like choreography, like we were learning each other's movements without needing to discuss them. We shared the space easily, too easily, and that's what scared me most. The next day, Jonah brought it up over breakfast. I was pouring coffee, trying to pretend the night before hadn't happened, trying to act like everything was normal. He sat at the table with a bowl of cereal, scrolling through his phone, and then he said it without looking up. Didn't know leftovers could get you that flustered. His tone was light, teasing, like it was a joke we were both in on. I felt my face heat. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, and he finally looked up, that familiar grin spreading across his face. He said, "Sure, okay," and went back to his cereal, but I could see the amusement in his eyes, the way he was trying not to laugh. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what he thought had happened, if he'd felt it too, or if I was alone in this strange awareness that had settled over me like a second skin. But I didn't. I finished pouring my coffee, grabbed my bag, and left for work without saying anything else. The day dragged. I sat at my desk, entering numbers into spreadsheets, my mind somewhere else entirely. I kept replaying the moment, the way Jonah had held that fork out, the way his hand had trembled just slightly, the way the silence had stretched between us until it felt like something physical. I told myself I was overthinking it. That Jonah was just being Jonah, playful and tactile, and unaware of how his casual gestures could mean something more to someone like me. Someone who'd spent so long starving for connection that even the smallest offering felt like a feast. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that we'd crossed some invisible line, and now we were both pretending we hadn't. When I got home that evening, the apartment smelled like garlic and herbs. I found Jonah in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, that same Bluetooth speaker playing something low and acoustic in the background. He glanced over when I walked in, smiled, said hey without breaking his rhythm. I asked him what he was making. He said just reheating the pasta from last night, seeing if he could make it taste better. Then he paused, turned down the heat, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said he'd been thinking about it all day, about how weird it was that we'd never really shared food like that before, how it felt strangely intimate, feeding someone, how he'd liked it more than he expected to. My heart was pounding. I didn't know what to say. I stood there in the doorway, still holding my bag, and tried to formulate a response that wouldn't give away how much his words affected me. Before I could speak, he turned back to the stove and said, "Want a bite?" His voice quieter this time, less playful, more genuine. I should have said no, should have laughed it off, changed the subject, done anything to diffuse the tension building in the space between us. But instead, I set my bag down, walked toward the counter, nodded. Jonah lifted the fork, twirled the pasta carefully like he had the night before. But this time, when he held it out, his hand trembled. Not much, just enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. I leaned in, took the bite. Our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. The pasta tasted better than it had the night before. Or maybe I was just paying more attention. Maybe I was finally letting myself acknowledge what was happening, this slow unraveling of the careful distance I'd maintained. Jonah didn't pull the fork back right away. He stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. He said, I think this is my new favorite way to eat. I asked him what he meant. He smiled, but it was different from his usual grin. Softer, almost vulnerable. He said sharing it with you makes it taste better somehow. The words hung in the air between us. I didn't know how to respond. Didn't know if I should acknowledge what he was really saying, or if I should keep pretending this was just about food, just about two roommates passing time in a kitchen. But then he set the fork down, turned to face me fully, and the look in his eyes made it impossible to pretend anymore. He said, I know we don't really talk about this stuff, but I want you to know that I like having you here. Not just as a roommate. I like you being around. I like cooking for you. I like when you let me feed you, even if it's weird or whatever. My throat felt tight. I managed to say it's not weird, even though my voice came out barely above a whisper. He stepped closer. Not much. Just enough that the space between us became almost non-existent. He said good, because I want to keep doing it. I didn't ask him what he meant by it. I didn't need to. We stood there in the kitchen with the pasta cooling on the stove and the music playing softly in the background, and I realized that this, whatever this was becoming, had been building for months. In every shared meal, every late-night conversation, every moment of comfortable silence, I've been so focused on protecting myself that I hadn't noticed I was already falling. And Jonah, with his openness and his messy warmth and his devastating honesty, had been falling too. The question now wasn't whether something was happening between us. The question was what we were going to do about it. It became a ritual after that. Not every night, but often enough that I started to anticipate it. Started to listen for the sound of Jonah moving around the kitchen after I got home, the clink of plates and silverware, the low hum of music that meant he was cooking something. I'd find excuses to join him, to lean against the counter while he worked, to ask about his day, to watch the way his hands moved as he chopped vegetables or stirred sauces. And inevitably, he'd offer me a taste, hold out a spoon or a fork, wait for me to lean in, hold my gaze just a second too long. The gesture itself was simple, innocent even, but the way we performed it had become anything but. Each time, the moment stretched a little longer. Each time, the space between us felt a little more charged. We were dancing around something, circling it without naming it, and I couldn't tell if that made it easier or harder to bear. One night, Jonah made stir-fry, something with chicken and vegetables and a sauce he'd been experimenting with all week. He was talking about his sister again, about how she called him crying over some argument with their mother, about how he never knew what to say to make things better. His voice carried that particular sadness it always did when he talked about his family, like he was mourning something he'd never quite had. I listened the way I always did, offering small comments when it felt right, mostly just being present. And when he held out the fork with a piece of chicken, I took it without hesitation. But this time, something was different. This time, when I pulled back, I let my fingers brush against his hand. Just for a second. Just enough to make it deliberate. Jonah went still. The fork hung in the air between us, forgotten. His eyes searched mine, looking for confirmation that I'd meant it, that it wasn't an accident. I didn't look away. He set the fork down slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was building between us. Then he said your name. Just that. Just Reese, spoken so softly it was almost a question. I told him I was tired of pretending. The words came out before I could stop them, before I could overthink or retreat back into safety. I said I was tired of acting like this was normal, like we were just roommates sharing a kitchen, like every time he fed me didn't feel like the most intimate thing I'd ever experienced. Jonah let out a breath that sounded like relief. He said he'd been waiting for me to say something, that he'd been terrified to push, to assume, to risk making me uncomfortable, that he'd been using food as an excuse to be close to me because he didn't know how else to bridge the distance. I asked him when it started, when he'd first felt it. He smiled, but it was tinged with something vulnerable, almost painful. He said probably the second week I lived here. You made coffee one morning and asked if I wanted some, and the way you said it, like you genuinely wanted to do something nice for me, like it mattered. I just thought, oh, I could fall for this person so easily. My chest ached. I'd had no idea. I'd been so focused on managing my own feelings that I hadn't seen his. I told him I thought I was the only one, that I'd convinced myself I was reading into things, manufacturing meaning where there was none, that I'd been so afraid of wanting something I couldn't have that I'd almost talked myself out of wanting it at all. Jonah reached out then, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I needed to. His hand found mine on the counter, fingers sliding between mine with a gentleness that made my breath catch. He said, I like seeing you take what I offer, because it feels like something more, even if I don't know what to call it yet. And there it was. The truth we'd been circling for weeks, maybe months. Laid bare in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and ginger, with half-cooked food cooling on the stove and music playing softly in the background. I squeezed his hand, told him I didn't know what to call it either, but that I wanted to figure it out. That I was scared, but I was tired of being scared alone. He said we could be scared together, if that helped. Said we didn't have to rush anything, didn't have to name it before we were ready. We could just keep doing this, sharing food, sharing space, sharing these small intimacies until they added up to something we could recognize. I nodded. It felt like enough. More than enough. That night, we finished cooking together. Really together, moving around each other in the small kitchen like we'd choreographed it, passing utensils and ingredients, laughing when we got in each other's way. And when the food was ready, Jonah plated it carefully, then held out the first bite to me like an offering. I took it, and this time, when he didn't pull his hand away, I reached up and wrapped my fingers around his wrist. Held him there. Let the moment expand until it filled the entire room. He whispered guess we're both hungry for something. I told him yeah, I think we are. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself be hungry. Let myself want without apologizing for it. Let myself imagine that maybe, just maybe, this careful thing we were building could hold the weight of everything I've been too afraid to hope for. Jonah was still holding the fort between us, but neither of us was thinking about food anymore. The days after that conversation felt different, lighter somehow, like we'd been holding our breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale. Nothing changed exactly. We still moved through our routines, still cooked together, still shared the same space and the same careful dance we perfected. But now, there was an acknowledgement underneath it all, a quiet understanding that we were building towards something neither of us had fully named yet. Jonah still found excuses to feed me, still held out forks and spoons with that same playful grin, but now there was something deeper in his eyes, something that said he knew what he was doing, what it meant, and he wasn't going to stop. And I stopped pretending I didn't want it. But a week after our conversation in the kitchen, something shifted in me, a restlessness I couldn't shake, because acknowledging what was happening between us wasn't the same as understanding it, and I realized I needed to know what this meant to him, what he wanted, what he saw when he looked at me. It was a Thursday night. Jonah had worked a double shift at the coffee shop and came home exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his usual energy dimmed. He still made dinner, though, still moved through the kitchen with that familiar rhythm, even if it was slower, more deliberate. I watched him from the doorway, watched the way his shoulders curved forward, the way he rubbed the back of his neck like he was trying to ease some invisible weight. And I thought about how much he gave to everyone around him, to his sister, to his mother, to the customers who demanded his smile and patience for hours on end. To me, I thought about what his ex had said. That loving Jonah felt like drowning. And I wondered if maybe the problem wasn't that Jonah was too much. Maybe the problem was that Marcus hadn't been enough, hadn't been willing to meet Jonah where he was, to match his openness with something equally brave. Jonah turned around, caught me watching. He smiled, tired but genuine, and asked if I was hungry. I told him I was. But then I asked him something I'd been carrying for days. I asked him why he kept doing this, why he kept feeding me, kept finding reasons to be close, kept offering himself in these small, careful ways. The smile faded from his face, not into sadness exactly, into something more serious, more vulnerable. He set down the spatula, turned to face me fully, and he said, "Because I like seeing you take what I offer. Because it feels like something more, even if I don't know what to call it yet." His voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor underneath. The fear that I might not understand, might not feel the same way, might pull back now that he'd said it out loud. I stepped into the kitchen, closed the distance between us until I was standing close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. I told him I thought I knew what to call it now. He waited, didn't push, just stood there with his heart in his eyes, giving me space to find the words. I said, "It feels like care, like tenderness, like you're trying to tell me something you don't have the language for yet, so you're using food instead. And I think what you're trying to say is that you want to take care of me, that you want me to let you." Jonah's breath hitched. He nodded slowly, and I watched something shift in his expression. Relief, recognition, like I just translated something he'd been trying to communicate for months. He said, Yeah, that's exactly it. I want to take care of you. I want you to let me be close to you. I want to know what you like, what makes you comfortable, what you need. And I don't know how to ask for that directly, so He gestured helplessly at the stove, at the scattered ingredients, at the whole domestic scene we'd created together. I told him he didn't have to use food as an excuse anymore, that he could just ask, that I wanted him to ask. He swallowed hard, asked me what I meant. I said, "Ask me what you want to know. Ask me to let you closer. Stop hiding behind the ritual, and just tell me what you're really asking for." For a moment, Jonah just stared at me. Then he took a breath, steadied himself, and spoke. He asked if he could touch me. Not while holding a fork, not while offering food. Just touch me because because he'd been wanting to for months, and it was driving him crazy to keep finding excuses. I told him yes. His hand came up slowly, carefully, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too fast. His palms settled against my cheek, warm and slightly calloused, and I felt my eyes flutter closed at the contact. He said my name again, Reese, like it was something precious. I opened my eyes, asked him what else he wanted. He said he wanted to know if I felt it too. If every time we share these moments in the kitchen, I felt the same electric pull. If I'd been just as terrified and just as unable to stop myself from falling. My chest ached with how much I wanted given the answer he needed. How much I wanted to be brave enough to match his vulnerability with my own. I told him I'd been falling since the first time he made me coffee and remembered exactly how I liked it. That I'd been terrified for months, convinced I was alone in this feeling. That every time he fed me felt like the most intimate thing I'd ever experienced, and I didn't know how to handle it. Jonah's thumb brushed across my cheekbone. He said, "We're both pretty terrible at this, huh?" I laughed. Told him, yeah, we really are. He said that was okay, that we could figure it out together. And standing there in the kitchen with his hand on my face and the smell of dinner filling the air around us, I believed him. The next night, I came home to find Jonah already in the kitchen. The same routine. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility instead of uncertainty. He was reheating leftovers again. The pasta from earlier in the week, the one that had started all of this. I watched him from the doorway, remembering the first time he'd held out that fork, the way my world had tilted on its axis in the space between one breath and the next. He looked up, saw me standing there, and smiled. Not the playful grin I'd grown used to, but something softer, more knowing. He asked if I was hungry. The question felt heavier than it should have, weighted with everything we'd said the night before, everything we'd admitted to each other. I told him I was. He nodded, turned back to the stove. I watched him plate the food with the same care he always did, watched the way his hands moved with practiced ease. And when he picked up the fork, twirled the pasta around it with deliberate slowness, I felt my heart begin to race. This was it, the moment we'd been building toward for weeks, maybe months. Jonah turned toward me, fork extended, that familiar gesture that had become our entire relationship distilled into a single action. But this time, something in his eyes told me he was waiting to see what I would do. waiting to see if I was brave enough to change the script we'd been following. I could have leaned in, could have taken the bite the way I always did, let the ritual continue unchanged. It would have been easy, safe. But I was tired of safe. I stepped forward, close enough that the fork was almost touching my chest, close enough that I could see the way Jonah's breathing had changed, shallow and uncertain. And instead of leaning toward the fork, I reached for his hand. My fingers wrapped around his wrist, steady and sure, and I watched his eyes widen, watched the way his lips parted slightly, the way he seemed to forget how to breathe. I turned his hand toward me, guided it closer, but I didn't take the bite. I just held him there, his wrist warm under my palm, his pulse racing against my fingertips. I told him he didn't have to pretend it was about the food anymore. The words hung between us. Final. Irrevocable. Jonah's hand trembled in my grip. He whispered my name, and it sounded like a question and an answer all at once. I told him I knew what he was really offering, that I'd known for a while now, that every time he fed me, he was asking if I'd let him closer, if I'd trust him with the parts of myself I kept hidden from everyone else. He swallowed hard, asked if I was saying yes. I said I was saying yes. To all of it. To whatever this was becoming. To letting him take care of me. To taking care of him in return. Jonah set the fork down. The movement was slow, deliberate, like he was putting away a prop he no longer needed. Then he turned back to me, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. He said he'd been waiting for this, for me to be ready, that he'd been terrified he was pushing too hard, moving too fast, asking for more than I could give. I told him he wasn't, that I'd been the one holding back, too afraid to reach for what I wanted because I'd spent so long convinced I didn't deserve it. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off his body, could see the individual flecks of gold and green in his eyes. He asked if he could kiss me. The question was so simple, so direct, so completely Jonah. I didn't answer with words. I just closed the distance between us. His lips met mine softly at first, tentative, like he was still afraid I might pull away. But when I leaned into him, when my free hand came up to rest against his chest, he deepened the kiss. His hand, the one I wasn't holding, came up to cut my face, his thumb brushing along my jaw with a tenderness that made my chest ache. The kiss tasted like possibility, like every meal we'd shared, every moment we'd circled around this, every unspoken word finally given voice. When we finally pulled apart, Jonah rested his forehead against mine. His breathing was unsteady, matching the frantic pace of my own heartbeat. He said he'd wanted to do that for so long, that every time he'd fed me, he'd imagined closing the distance, imagined what it would feel like to kiss me instead of hiding behind the excuse of sharing food. I told him he never had to hide again, that I wanted this, wanted him, wanted whatever we were building together, messy and uncertain and terrifying as it was. He smiled against my lips, said we should probably eat dinner before it gets cold. I laughed, told him I didn't care about dinner, but he pulled back anyway, picked up the fork again, and held it out with that same playful grin I'd fallen for months ago. Except now, there was no pretense, no careful distance, just the simple offering of someone who wanted to take care of me, who wanted to be close, who wasn't afraid to show it anymore. I took the bite, and this time when he pulled the fork away, he leaned in and kissed me again, tasting the sauce on my lips, smiling against my mouth. He said this is better. This is what he'd wanted all along. I told him me too. And standing there in our small kitchen with cooling pasta and soft music playing in the background, I realized that everything I'd been afraid of, the vulnerability, the risk, the possibility of loss, was worth it for this. For him. For us. Weeks passed. Then months. The seasons shifted outside our windows, autumn giving way to the first cold breath of winter, but inside our apartment, everything felt warmer than it had before. The kitchen still looked the same. Cluttered counters scattered with Jonah's experiments, mismatched containers stacked in the refrigerator, that Bluetooth speaker still playing soft music in the background while we moved around each other in our familiar choreography. But nothing was the same. Not really. Jonah still cooked too much. Still insisted I try everything first, still held out forks and spoons with that playful smile I'd memorized down to the smallest detail. But now, when he offered me a bite, there was no hesitation, no careful distance, no pretending it meant anything other than exactly what it was. Care, tenderness, love, though he hadn't quite said that word yet. I learned the rhythm of him, learned that he hummed when he was focused, that he always tasted the sauce at least 3 times before he was satisfied, that he cooked when he was anxious because it gave his hand something to do. Learned that the way he fed me was the same way he expressed everything he didn't have words for, through action, through presence, through the simple offering of himself. And I learned to receive it, learned to let him take care of me without feeling like I was asking for too much. Learned that accepting what he offered didn't make me weak or dependent. It just made me loved. One night in early December, I came home to find him in the kitchen again. It was late, past 11, and I'd worked overtime trying to finish a project before the holidays. I was exhausted, my shoulders tight with tension, my mind still half occupied with spreadsheets and deadlines. Jonah looked up when I walked in, and something in his expression softened. He didn't ask how my day was. He just held out his hand. I took it, let him pull me closer, let him wrap his arms around me in the middle of the kitchen, my face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and coffee, and whatever he'd been cooking. He asked if I'd eaten. I told him I hadn't. He pulled back just enough to look at my face, brushed his thumb across my cheek, and told me to sit down. That he'd make me something. I tried to protest, to tell him I could just grab something quick, that he didn't need to go through the trouble. But he shook his head, already moving toward the refrigerator with that determined look he got when he decided to take care of someone. So I sat, watched him move through the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling out ingredients, heating oil in a pan, his movements economical and sure. He made something simple, scrambled eggs with cheese, toast with butter, nothing elaborate. But he made it with the same attention he gave everything, tasting and adjusting, making sure it was exactly right. When he plated it, he brought it to the table and sat down across from me, picked up the fork and held out the first bite. I smiled, took it from his hand. And this time, I didn't think about what it meant or what we were doing or how far we'd come from that first night when everything changed. I just let him feed me, let him take care of me the way he always wanted to. He watched me eat with that soft expression I'd grown to recognize, the one that said, I see you, I know you, I'm here. And when I was halfway through, he reached across the table and took my free hand, lacing our fingers together. He said he liked this, liked coming home to me, liked cooking for me, liked these quiet moments where nothing existed except the two of us and the space we'd carved out together. I told him I liked it too, more than I'd ever thought I could like anything. He asked if I remembered the first time he fed me. That night with the pasta, the way we'd both been so careful, so uncertain. I told him of course I remembered, that I thought about it all the time, how terrified I'd been, how sure I was that I was reading too much into a simple gesture. He laughed softly, said he'd been just as terrified, that he'd been working up the courage to do it for days, trying to figure out how to be close to me without scaring me away. I squeezed his hand, told him he never could have scared me away, that even when I was too afraid to admit what I was feeling, some part of me was already his. His eyes went soft. He stood up, came around to my side of the table, and kissed me, slow and sweet and tasting like the eggs we'd been sharing. When he pulled back, he said he thought maybe he loved me, that he wasn't sure when it started, but it was there now, solid and undeniable, and he wanted me to know. My chest felt too full, too tight, like everything I'd been holding back for months was finally demanding to be acknowledged. I told him I love him too, that I'd probably loved him since he first asked if I wanted coffee, maybe even before that I'd been falling slowly and steadily, and now there was no part of me that wasn't tangled up in him. He smiled, that beautiful, open smile that at first made me believe that maybe I deserved something good. We finished dinner together, shared the last few bites, his fork and mine, no longer needing the ritual, but keeping it anyway, because it was ours, because it meant something, because love, we'd learned, didn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it started with leftovers in a dark kitchen, with a fork held out between two people who were too afraid to say what they wanted, with small acts of care that accumulated over time until they became something neither of us could deny. The apartment was quiet around us. The music had stopped playing at some point, but neither of us moved to restart it. We just sat there in the gentle silence, hands linked across the table, the remains of our simple meal scattered between us. And I thought about how far we'd come, how much had changed since that first night when everything shifted, how I'd spent so long being careful, being afraid, protecting myself from the very thing I needed most. Jonas stood up, started clearing the dishes, and I moved to help him. We washed up together, our shoulders brushing, our movements synchronized. And when we were done, he took my hand again and led me to the couch, pulled me down beside him, wrapped his arms around me like he never wanted to let go. I rested my head against his chest, listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, let myself sink into the warmth of him, into the safety of this thing we'd built together. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, whispered that he was glad I let him feed me that first night, that he was glad I stayed, that he couldn't imagine this life without me in it anymore. I told him I couldn't either. And there, in our small apartment with its cluttered kitchen and its secondhand furniture and its history of shared meals and quiet confessions, I finally understood what I'd been searching for all along. Not just love, but home.